Good day, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle John Packer. Je suis le directeur du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement des droits de la personne à l'Université d'Ottawa. C'est mon grand plaisir de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour notre fête de l'anniversaire de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme de l'ONU. It's the 73rd anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. Today on the 10th of December, and we're very pleased to host everyone. My name is John Packer, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. I hope you will see on your screen behind me is also recognition of our 40th anniversary, founded in 1981, 82, inspired by the United Nations Human Rights Framework, and to bring human rights into the Canadian Constitution, of which we will celebrate more in the spring of 2022, the 40th anniversary of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Today, it's our pleasure to host, I think, a rare kind of event where we have renowned Canadian human rights advocates and scholars who have been engaged and are engaged in human rights promotion, protection, and advocacy around the world. One who currently holds a special rapporteur appointment in the United Nations, and two who have, and until recently, held such positions. It's my pleasure now to invite a dear friend and colleague, Alex Neve, well known to everyone in Canada and the human rights world. Alex is a former Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada Anglophone section. He is a senior fellow associate with the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and he's a adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa and a close associate in our Human Rights Center. So without further ado, Alex, I invite you. Alex will moderate today's session and introduce our guest speakers.
Well, thank you so much, John, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Because, friends, I know that we have a very engaging conversation ahead with three remarkable Canadian human rights champions, and very pleased that you've been able to join for that. I know that being the day it is today, there's a lot of competition out there in online space with numerous events going on. So very pleased that, that people have been able to join us. I'd like to begin by noting that we're very honored that to be joining you today from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory here in Ottawa. Certainly where Leilani Farha and of course where the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Center are all based. And also from McGill University in Montreal, on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations, and that's where Francois Crepeau is based, as well as from Western University in London, Ontario, which is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wuk, and Chunongton nations, and that's of course where Michael Link is based. As John noted, we are particularly pleased to be coming together for this discussion on December the 10th, which is of course International Human Rights Day, which, as he's reminded us, this year marks the 73rd anniversary of the UN's adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948. And obviously we chose today with that very anniversary in mind. Seemed very fitting to have this conversation on Human Rights Day. I guess it never seems particularly apt to say Happy Human Rights Day or to say that we are celebrating Human Rights Day. And that's of course because in its very essence, this is a day that is both somber and joyful. And that's of course because the state of human rights in our world remains particularly dire in 2021. And I imagine we're going to hear more about some instances of that from Leilani, Michael, and Francois as they describe the issues and concerns that have preoccupied them as special rapporteurs. And certainly on that side, there is nothing happy or celebratory about this day. But there is, of course, also much that is uplifting and very encouraging. And I'm sure that we're going to share those reflections as well as we hear from our three panelists. So much progress and a lot of good news over all of those 73 years. And even right up until the last couple of weeks, good news this week in Canada, for instance, with all parties in the House of Commons and the Senate uniting in remarkable unanimity to pass important human rights legislation banning conversion therapy, and doing so in very short order. And of course, tremendous inspiration out of Oslo today as the remarkable human rights crusading journalists, Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, are honored with the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, today is an opportunity for us to explore and learn about the important work carried out by a cadre of independent human rights experts who are appointed at the UN Human Rights Council to carry out in-depth human rights research, analysis, advocacy with respect to a wide range of pressing thematic human rights challenges and also worrying human rights situations in a number of countries. They're known collectively as the special procedures, most of whom serve as special rapporteurs, but also a number of whom are independent experts or part of 5-member working groups. And in 2021, this number fluctuates a bit from year to year, but right now there are currently 45 thematic mandates and 13 country-specific mandates. These experts are appointed to a maximum of 2 back-to-back 3-year terms, and they play an absolutely vital role in safeguarding human rights around the world. One of the quotes I'm very fond of is that former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan once referred to the special procedures as the crown jewel of the UN human rights system. And over the years, a number of Canadians have been appointed to these very important special procedures roles. Michael Link, joining us today, is approaching the end of serving as Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory over the past 6 years. And when his term is up, that will leave 2 Canadians who are continuing to serve as Special Rapporteurs right now, David Boyd, who is the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and Fernand de Varenne, who is the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. Well, we are very fortunate to have Michael, Leilani, and Francois with us today. It would take far, far too long for me to give full justice to the impressive biographies of these 3 Canadian human rights leaders. I believe those bios are available online as part of the invitation to today's events. I've had the tremendous honor of working closely with each of them over many years and know them to be passionate, committed, and brilliant advocates with respect to the human rights concerns that were at the heart of their respective mandates, but more widely with respect to human rights issues, both domestically and internationally. Leilani Farha is presently the global director of The Shift, an international movement to secure the right to housing. And she served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing between 2014 and 2020. Francois Crepeau is a full professor and the Hans and Tamar Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law at the Faculty of Law of McGill University. And he served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants between 2011 and 2017. And Michael Link is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at Western University, and his 6 years as UN Special Rapporteur for the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory began in May of 2016. So let's turn to the conversation because that's what you've all joined for. And for the next 45 minutes or so, what I'm going to do is have a conversation with Michael, Francois, and Leilani. We're going to go through a range of questions. Sometimes I'll be asking all of them to respond. Other times, perhaps one or two of them to respond. And then over to you to pose questions that you may have. And you can do that in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Et certainement, si vous voulez poser des questions en français, Francois Crepeau est certainement prêt à répondre. So let's kick it off. And I'm going to start things off with, I guess, what is a bit of a personal question. You have each contributed to addressing the serious human rights concerns at the heart of your respective mandates, housing Palestinians and migrants, in many important, impressive, and varying ways over many years. So I'm curious, what was it, given all of those ways in which you've been active, what was it about serving as a special rapporteur that interested you? And maybe were you surprised when you were appointed? And let's start off with Michael.
Thank you for that, Alex. What was attractive about serving as special rapporteur? I had worked, I'm trained and I'm an academic in labor law, so which may seem like a big, considerable distance from the issue of Palestine, but I'd always had an interest in that area of the world. And I had actually served with the UN in Jerusalem at the end of the 1980s during the first Palestinian Intifada on human rights and refugee issues. And that once you've done work like that, that gets into your blood. So once I shifted from being a practicing lawyer to an academic, I wrote on areas of labor law, but I also wrote on areas with respect to international law and its application to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So the idea of wanting to serve on an international level, I was encouraged by members of civil society to apply. But when I applied, I never thought I was going to wind up getting it. So the second half of your question is, were you surprised? Surprise would be a great understatement. I interviewed, I saw where I was listed. I was listed actually as the second choice of the committee. And I was expecting that, well, you know, that's a great honor to be chosen second, and I'll live with that. And then it was a complete surprise to be chosen, to be told I was chosen as special rapporteur. I still remember the moment, and Leilani had a role in this because she found out, she was already special rapporteur. She told a good mutual friend of ours, and I was, when the mutual friend phoned me and said I was chosen, I was absolutely astonished that I had been chosen with respect to this, and I didn't believe her. I said, "You've got it wrong." And I've since learned that I've always got to trust Leilani on things like this. And you said I was surprised, you know, asked about surprise. Yes, I was surprised, but then I was surprised again, if you like, because the heavens fell down on me for the next week or so. The foreign minister at the time, Stéphane Dion, tweeted against my appointment, which in some ways is absolutely astonishing that a Canadian political leader would tweet with respect to a UN appointment with regards to this. And you know, someone who's always worked within the confines of international law, within the framework well established by the UN, I was surprised, astonished, and taken off guard that my positions were criticized because I was working within what the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council had said. But as you may guess, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later on, you know, I serve in an unusual mandate that tends to attract a lot of lightning bolts.
Well, I think you've given me a good segue to turning to Leilani now, given that you've noted that she's always right. So Leilani, what about your feelings of why? Why was this of interest to you, and perhaps were you surprised?
First of all, just a huge thanks for inviting me into the conversation. I have to say that Michael and Francois ran incredible, and Michael is still running incredible mandates, and both are inspirational to me. And Francois was already rapporteur before I was appointed, and I learned a tremendous amount from him and his mandate. He probably doesn't know this, but we had annual meetings, and it was a moment where you could absorb what other rapporteurs are doing. And I really did absorb from Francois some of his methods and his manner, his demeanor. And if you don't know about Michael Lincoln, his mandate, you should be following him and what he's done. Tremendous, and one of the most, if not the most difficult mandate. Yeah, why did I want to be rapporteur? Well, foolishness, maybe, folly. No, I mean, I saw it as a real opportunity to make change because you have direct access to governments. And even though, not all governments are equal, at the Human Rights Council, they have to at least pretend to be interested in human rights. And so they will give you their ear, a little less so at the General Assembly and the Third Committee, but certainly at the Human Rights Council. So I knew it was this huge opportunity. Housing is one of those issues that affects people so deeply, fundamentally, is so obviously just a fundamental human right. And yet, when I assumed the mandate in 2014, I felt like it was undervalued and being underplayed. And I really was happy to take on the opportunity to change people's minds about how important and fundamental this is as a human right. And I guess lastly, I'd say on that part of the question, my predecessors were not human rights lawyers. And so I was interested in putting my hat in the ring as a lawyer, because I do think that I, and I think it proved to be true, that I brought with the mandate, with me as an advocate, that kind of legal inquiry about the right to housing. I really was keen on fleshing out the legal standards of the right to housing, and that hadn't quite been done in my predecessors' mandates. I mean, they were both brilliant, but just weren't human rights lawyers. And so, of course, brought different strengths and skills to the mandate. In terms of surprise, yeah, I was totally surprised. I was like Michael, I was ranked second. So you get ranked top three. And normally the person in the first position is the one that the president of the council appoints. And so I had seen that I was second. I was like Michael, I was like, cool. Actually, I was kind of relieved. I was like, good. That's like nice. I'm obviously like pretty good. I made it to second. And now I can just go on with my life. And then I heard that the president of the council, I didn't know why, I still don't know why, switched the order. And he decided to rank me as the first. And I was like completely sick to my stomach, literally. I called you said it was a personal question, so here's the personal answer. I called my partner and I said, oh my God, what am I going to do? I was crying. I don't want this position. This is too much. It's crazy. What was I thinking? And then when it came to the actual appointments, it didn't happen. So I woke up at like some crazy hour, 4 a.m. And it was actually because of the OPT mandate and the food mandate, there was a lot of horse trading and geopolitical stuff going on. And they didn't end up appointing housing, food, and OPT in that round. And so I got a small reprieve. I got my head together. And then a few months later, it happened. And by then, I think I was ready.
Wow. Now, Francois, this is going to be interesting to see if you keep this going. We've got 2 silver medalists here. So over to you to share a bit about what interested you in taking up the migrants post. And was there any surprise for you?
Yes. I came to the mandate because of a phone call from a friend of my wife who phoned her and said, the mandate is open. Francois should apply. I had not thought about it at all. And I had been working on migration issues for 30 years. And migration issues were not a UN issue. states did not discuss migration at the UN. The International Organization for Migration, which had been created almost at the same time under another name as the UNHCR, remained outside the UN until 2016. States said migration is a sovereignty issue. It's not for discussion at international cooperation fora, such as the UN. It was discussed at the EU, it was discussed in some regional outfits, but not at the UN. And Kofi Annan fought a battle to bring it into the UN, found someone called Peter Sutherland, who was very prominent and trusted by states. And with his help, there was the creation of a global forum on migration and development in 2006, which Peter Sutherland said would be exclusively for states, no NGOs, nothing, and would only discuss economic migration. And states came to the table, and the GFMD happened every year. And in 2010, Mexico was the host, and they put the human rights of migrants on the table, and they invited civil society. And suddenly the conversation at multilateral level was open. That was December 2010. I had applied in August 2010, took my appointment in July 2011, and I was really fortunate. It was happenstance, but I was really fortunate that I was arriving at the mandate at the moment that the multilateral conversation was opening. My two predecessors did fantastic work on deaf ears, because nothing happened because states didn't want to hear anything about that. But starting in 2010, and my mandate started at the same time, so I was quite fortunate. And I can say that, you know, in the face of two silver medalists, I was a bronze medalist. I was number 3 on the short list. And first of all, I had applied, and I never had any news from the UN, 0 news, until I was appointed, until I received the letter of appointment in Montreal on paper. There was no interview at the time, so no communication whatsoever. I had news from friends who told me, oh, you made it on the list. Oh, you're on the short list, et cetera, et cetera. You're appointed, just like Michael. But, you know, the first communication of the UN was, you know, like 10 months later. Second, I learned why, contrary to Leilani, I learned why I was appointed. The two, number 1 and number 2 on the list were from IOM and ILO. They were historical figures of IOM and ILO. And I think the ambassadors who form the committee that choose the special rapporteurs didn't want known voices and pretty harsh voices. So as one of them said publicly a few weeks after I was appointed, they chose the most inoffensive candidate. So was I surprised? Yes, absolutely. One thing that surprised me up to a point was never to have had any communication from the Canadian government. 0. It was the Harper years. No acknowledgement I was appointed, no communication with the mission in Geneva, except once to tell me how disappointed they were with my report. And that was a bit of a surprise. I was expecting, you know, at least good manners, a note saying, you know, Canada's proud of your appointment, whatever. Not for my personal sake, but for the fact that a Canadian is appointed. You send a note. No, didn't happen.
Well, you know, I had no idea when I included this as part of the first question that we were going to get this wonderful sort of connection amongst the three of you. It seems like there's something very quintessentially Canadian about this story of each of you kind of coming out of nowhere, sneaking up quietly on the world, and then rising to brilliance. So that's quite notable. Excellent. Well, let's move on to round 2. And this is where I'd like to get into the substance of the work you did. it's already become clear to everyone the three very inconsequential human rights topics at the heart of your mandates: the rights of Palestinians, the right to adequate housing, the rights to migrants. Obviously challenging, contentious, important human rights issues. So maybe if you could, and again, maybe a bit of a two-part here. I mean, I'm sure you could do a 1-hour lecture easily on the substance of what was entailed in your work, but maybe give us a flavor of the substance of the human rights topics that you were covering. And then, is there, thinking over those 6 years or 5.5 years for you, Michael, is there a particular achievement or development that to you feels particularly significant? So why don't we start with you this time, Leilani?
Sure. So I guess there were 3 things that marked my mandate in terms of substantive issues. One might be quite surprising to most people. I would hope it's surprising. But when I assumed the role, it became quite clear to me that though homelessness is a huge problem and issue in every country around the world, I think, there are no real estimates, but something like 850 million people or something, I don't know, 500 million people, something like that, living in homelessness. It's a completely inaccurate number. It's probably much more than that. We know 1.6 billion are living in homelessness and inadequate housing, grossly inadequate housing. So, but homelessness itself wasn't actually being articulated as a human rights issue, which is just like so phenomenal to me. I mean, how could it not be when you think about the many ways in which it is violative of human rights, and across the board, so many human rights. But obviously, if you take that big zoomed out, what are human rights all about? And if you take human dignity being really central, then obviously living a life of dignity when you're sleeping on a street or in a park and you don't have access to a toilet or a shower, electricity and all of that, it's obvious, just so obvious that you can't have a life of dignity. And of course, we know that homelessness really is so directly related to, now we certainly know, rights to health, but even the right to life itself and to security of the person. And that sort of segues. So I spent a lot of time, I wrote a thematic report on homelessness, and I spent a lot of time interpreting the Sustainable Development Goals in a way that people would understand, governments that would understand that what they had committed to was to eliminating homelessness, because the Sustainable Development Goals set as a target for states adequate, affordable, and secure housing for all by 2030. So if that doesn't suggest the elimination of homelessness, what does? So I spent a lot of my mandate doing that, and then I also tried throughout my mandate to really make connections between the right to adequate housing and the right to life. And of course, it was all brought home on March 13th when COVID was declared a pandemic, and we knew it was going to have disastrous results for people who are living rough or living in homelessness. So I did actually write a thematic report on the right to life and the right to housing. I felt it was really important to make those linkages, again, to expose the centrality of housing in people's lives and why it has to be understood as a fundamental human right. And I suppose the third issue that I'm most well known for, I'd say, was an issue that actually was not being discussed at all from a human rights point of view in the area of housing. And that is what I call the financialization of housing. So that's where housing, particularly since the global financial crisis, is being treated as for its speculative value, as a commodity, but in new ways. And I think we all now know there's like so much money floating around the world, global capital. It's crazy how much money there is, more money now than ever before. And I mean, just take the last 2 years of the pandemic, or 21 months or whatever of the pandemic. We know that something like a new billionaire is created every 17 hours. I mean, it's just crazy, the money that's out there. Already wealthy people, billionaires, increased their wealth by 54% in the last year. I mean, it's nuts. And where are they putting their money? They're putting it in housing. And so are pension funds, insurance companies, et cetera. So I really wanted to tackle that issue. My assistant at the UN had said to me, let's do a report where we follow the money. And I just love that idea. So we started following the money. And then as a result of that, a documentary film maker approached me and wanted to make a film about this financialization of housing. So the second part of your question, is there one advance or development you achieved? I think it is putting that issue on the map, on the human rights map, in a really meaningful way. A lot of governments have started to engage this. And then the only other thing I'd say is, I think I've helped, I hope, I mean, I think it was one of my strengths. I think I've advanced the right to housing by making it seem popular and an accessible human right, like that it's not like all this tough human rights legislation and law that people can't get their heads around, but that it's, you know, kind of easy to understand when there's a violation and it's not that difficult to solve it. And I tried to use a whole bunch of means in my mandate, from, you know, social media to documentary film, et cetera. And now I have a podcast to try to move forward the right to housing in that popular way. Great,
thank you. How about over to you, Francois, a bit of an overview of what was at the heart of your work and a particularly significant achievement or development.
Yeah. I also had 3 phases or 3 themes in my mandate. The first theme was dictated sort of by what was happening on the ground at the time, 2011, 2012, Syrian crisis, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey being hosting millions of people, and some people starting to cross the Mediterranean to go to Europe. So I started with a big study of European policies. I visited Turkey, Tunisia, Malta, Italy 2 times, Greece 2 times, Brussels several times, meeting with officials there. And the issue was the condition, legal status, but also social condition of undocumented migrants, visiting detention centers, seeing children and families in detention, visiting centers at borders, etc. And so I wrote several reports on these countries, but also on EU policies, telling the EU that they got it wrong and they needed to change policies. Never happened, but I had great conversations within the EU with these people. The second theme was temporary migrant workers, who, you know, all countries have undocumented migrants. Almost all countries in the world have undocumented migrants. Many countries have established temporary migrant worker programs and receive sometimes enormous, you know, an enormous number of temporary migrant workers. I visited Qatar. 90% of the population of Qatar are temporary migrant workers. So, you know, the others are citizens, 10%. And so temporary migrant workers in many countries, including Canada, are not well treated. They're not well paid. They are not well housed, to connect with Leilani, not well fed. They're working, you know, hours on end. They're working weekends. They don't have, they just have their basic salary, etc. And so that is happening in the Middle East, Qatar, for example, with people coming from the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Nepal. I visited Sri Lanka and Nepal to prepare for these reports. The recruitment agencies, the recruitment industry is you know, very problematic. That's a mild term. It is telling lies constantly to the people, saying that they will have great contracts, do lots of work and come back home with lots of money, which rarely happens. Employers are not held to standards, etc. So I wrote on that. I wrote on several countries, and I wrote on that as well as on the recruitment industry. And then the 2015 European migration crisis happened, which was a crisis of governance, not a migration crisis. What's 1 million people over 12 months for a continent of 500 million? I mean, the EU could have absorbed them easily, just as Germany did, mostly. Germany, who talks about the Syrians in Germany today? You know, they are integrated. Their kids speak German like any German born. So, but it was a political crisis. And so that happened, that because it was a European crisis, it became a world crisis. As long as it happened in the you know, the global south, it wasn't world crisis, but if it's Europe, it's world crisis. So it triggered the UN to get together and to decide that migration was a UN issue. We had the New York Declaration in 2016 announcing the global compacts of 2018, and IOM was brought into the UN family. So at that moment, I knew that I could contribute to that because I had been preparing that for quite a number of years, and I contributed several reports to what was to become the global compact, and what states needed to do. I can't see anything in the global compact that relates to my reports, but certainly I was going in the same direction. So maybe I did contribute. I don't know about that. So these are the three elements that I brought to the mandate successively. They overlapped a bit, but successively. Something I'm proud of. I'm certainly not proud of the situation of migrants today, because politically it's worse than it was when I began my mandate. And it's not going to be better anytime soon for most undocumented and temporary migrant workers. But the Global Compact was a big surprise. In the Global Compact, states committed to things that I never thought they would commit to. And this is because of it was negotiated below the radar of national politics. It was an intergovernmental conference. It was not a UN conference. No, migration issues are never multilateral. It was an intergovernmental conference, which was led by two very good ambassadors, the ambassador of Mexico and the ambassador of Switzerland, and they negotiated that very discreetly. And politicians didn't see that coming, actually. The text was accepted in July 2018, and it was ready for signature in December 2018, and politicians woke up in November saying, oh, many politicians, Hungary, Poland, a few countries refused to sign, many countries abstained, but 153 countries of the UN General Assembly voted for it. And what it says there is very often the opposite of what states are doing. It says you should open up legal avenues for mobility. You should regularize all the undocumented migrants. You should apply labor law. You know, things that seem obvious, but that states had never actually said. And now they've said that. What I'm proud of has something to do with that, but I've spent a lot of time educating the media. Well, there's no educating the yellow press. So I had my share of insults from the yellow press, especially the British one. But I talked to a number of journalists, and I think I contributed to changing the tone of the conversation. Today, we have in most serious media, journalists who know what they're talking about when they talk about migration. And this was not the case 10, 15 years ago. In our newspapers in Canada, they would reproduce the speech of the Minister of Immigration uncritically. Now it's a lot more sophisticated. And I spent a lot of time doing that. And I think that will pay off in time. But I'm not expecting changes, even though states have signed the Global Compact. I'm not expecting it to be implemented until another generation. And I have to blame my generation for not being sensitive to the discrimination against migrants. I think that our kids who are in urban settings, in multicultural, multi-religious groups of students in their schools, will have a much better sensitivity to this issue and will not accept the kind of discrimination that my generation has accepted. And these are generational changes, just like divorce and same-sex marriage were generational changes. I think the attitude towards the foreigner is going to change, but it's going to take 10, 20 years, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. I'm struck by the fact that both you and Leilani have highlighted that notion of having made progress with respect to communication and kind of changing the debate, building understanding as something that you achieved. Very interesting, because I think, you know, probably not conventionally what people think of as being the key role of the special procedures. Michael, how about over to you, an overview of the, I'm sure, you know, very straightforward work with respect to the rights of Palestinians and something that you felt was consequential or significant.
Sure. Let me start off by saying that I think the paradox or the irony of my position is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli occupation of Palestine is, on the one hand, probably the most documented and most reported conflict in the modern world. There is so much written about it in books and articles and in reports. The reporting coming from the UN and from international human rights organizations and regional human rights organizations is astoundingly productive. There's lots of it, and it's generally of very high quality. Yet the irony is that it's also one of the least understood conflicts in the modern world as well. I'm always reminded of that quip by George Orwell, where he says something to the effect of, "To see what is in front of one's nose needs constant struggle." And this, you know, this would be lifetime security for me, job security for me to be, and whoever takes this position, because this will always wind up being needed. It is very difficult to get opinion makers, political and diplomatic opinion makers, to understand that what we're seeing with this 54-year-old occupation, the longest in the modern world, is that this occupation is now becoming indistinguishable from annexation. And if I think I had any role at all in the time I've been Special Rapporteur, it's been pointing out the issue of international accountability, how it's needed and how it's lacking with respect to this. I should point out that I'm not allowed into the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel forbade my two predecessors from going there, and that ban, that prohibition continues with me. So when I do go to the region, I go to Amman, Jordan, and I meet UN people or NGOs and human rights defenders will come across the Jordan River to meet me in Amman. But if there's one thing that I harp upon is accountability, it's because in essence, the international community has given up on a settlement with respect to just settlement with respect to Israel and Palestine. In my 5.5 years since 2016, I've seen no evidence of any strategy that the international community has with respect to this. They will repeat two-state solution as a mantra, but this has become in many ways a diplomatic pantomime to be brought out in the same way that thoughts and prayers are brought out whenever there's been another mass shooting in the United States. It's a substitute for any kind of solution or any kind of decision or attempt to try to make hard decisions on doing this. So what my work generally has consisted of is both the immediate and the analytical. On the immediate, there's always something else to want to comment on. In the last few months, I've commented upon Israel's designation of 6 leading human rights organizations among the Palestinians as terrorist and unlawful organizations. And that looks like that issue is going south. It's going to get worse. I've had a comment recently on the rising levels of settler violence, on the growth of the settlements, and Gaza. There's always Gaza to have to comment on, because that situation is ill-reported and there is a society and an economy absolutely on its back. But in terms of the broader analysis, what I think I've brought with respect to my reports, with respect to, I guess, my public appearances, is addressing the issue of accountability, pointing out that the international community has accepted that it, in the form of the United Nations, has a permanent responsibility for the issue of Israel and Palestine until that is finally resolved. If you read the memoirs of great UN figures like Brian Urquhart or Kofi Annan, they will say that the issue of Israel and Palestine haunts the hallways of the United Nations, and it's been a mortal wound that the UN has carried ever since 1947, almost at the very founding. This is one of the first monumental decisions that the UN, very young UN, made. And if you look back, you can realize that the UN in 1947 was very different from the UN of 1980 or the UN of 2021. It's unlikely that a decision that it made back then would have occurred today, partitioning a mandate into two separate states against the wishes of its majority population. Be that as it may, then my job continues to be trying to remind the international community that has accepted this permanent responsibility, and what I've done is point out issues of, is the occupation still legal? And there seems to be a movement now that this issue of what I've brought up in my report should be brought up to as an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice. So there's a possibility there. I've raised issues with respect to the status of the Israeli settlements vis-a-vis the Rome Statute of 1998. And that issue is now in front of not thanks to me, but I've been a part of it, that this issue is now in front of the prosecutor at the ICC. So those are the range of issues that I wind up playing, because I have to keep repeating, this occupation will not die of old age. And without a strategy, then Israel is playing chess while the rest of the world is playing checkers on this. And the occupation, I'm sad to say, during my time, has become deeper, thicker, and even more intractable than ever.
Wow, I mean, what a tour through those three mandates, and it really gives you a sense of the breadth, even when you have a very specific human rights topic, the breadth that's involved. And both, I think all of you have conveyed that sense of there being aspects that were about the immediate and the urgent, but also this longer term analytical change perspective. Mm-hmm. So I see we're starting to get some questions come in the Q&A. We'll get to those in a moment. We're now going to go to the what would they say in the game shows? It's the fast fire round or something, where instead of getting everyone to respond to each of these questions, I'm going to ask a couple of you to respond to each. So the next question, I guess, gets to a little bit of the flavor of today, Human Rights Day, which, as I said in my opening remarks, is very much an up and down kind of day, the good and the bad of human rights. And I'm sure that very much for all of you reflects what the mandate was about, that there were aspects of the work that were tremendously difficult and disappointing. But also aspects that were uplifting and hope-filled and inspiring. So maybe if you could share just a bit of a sense of each side of that. And we'll go to Leilani and then Michael on this one. So Leilani?
Sure. Well, we may be the crown jewel, but we certainly didn't have any jewels. The lack of resources for rapporteurs is phenomenal. And I am a believer that rapporteurs play a really important role within the UN human rights system and for human rights globally. Rapporteurs are so accessible, and we can be on the ground in the way that, let's say, treaty monitoring bodies are less so. And there's a nimbleness, a flexibility to the mandates, to the rapporteurships. So the fact that we are so poorly resourced is hugely problematic, not just in that some of us didn't even have full-time assistants helping us all the time from within the UN system, which is what you're supposed to have. I mean, there were so many, there was so much poverty in terms of resources. It was really remarkable to me. We're not paid, which means that only it then creates a very exclusive club of who can become a rapporteur. Because, for example, most, let's say, people working in NGOs wouldn't be able to have their NGO supporting them to then become a rapporteur. I was quite an exception to the rule, I'd say. And I had to negotiate with my very poor NGO that had no money, Canada Without Poverty. And then I had to spend a lot of time raising money just to have the right kinds of supports in place. I was lucky enough to be able to do that, and then ended up creating my own team. But that lack of resources is really suggestive of the value of human rights within the UN system. Let's just leave it there. Other difficult and disappointing things. So there's a lot of sexism everywhere. And so, of course, it's there when you're a rapporteur. And I'm not sure, there was some sexism within the system itself. So I think some of the, with due respect to my colleagues, older white men in particular might have carried a little more sense of gravitas than someone scrappy and younger seeming like me. I'm actually not that young, but I had a little feeling of that sometimes, like when rules were being made or not made, or enforced and not enforced, and who were they being enforced against and why. And so there was that, but there was a lot of sexism in the field itself. So I would arrive into a country, of course, and this is not something that can be controlled for through the UN system necessarily, but I think I was invited into some really tough countries from a point of kind of sexism. Oh, she's got like a motherhood issue, housing. Yeah. She's a woman, she's kind of young. She's not going to do us any harm. Let's have her come in. So I, for example, got into Egypt when I was the first rapporteur to go to Egypt in, I think, 8 or 10 years. I got into Nigeria, I got into India. And then I think there was a kind of like, oh shit, she's serious and she's not so mild and smiley and, but that was good. That's a strength. And I ended up disarming people. So that's cool. And then I would say the most difficult aspect of my mandate, 100%, was my mission to Egypt. 100%. I was declared an enemy of the state. I'm not even sure I could travel to Egypt now. I mean, it was in Parliament that I was declared this enemy of the state. And I didn't feel that the UN system had my back until well into the trouble. So I was really kind of like on my own, on the ground. And I had been taken aside. I guess it's not a real detention, but I had been taken aside by the police for many hours and in the middle of my mission, and all sorts of, it was very, very trying for me and my team. We felt very, that we were not in a secure situation, and the lives of the people we were interviewing and meeting with were at risk 100%. And many of them did suffer consequences as a result of my mission, something I wear very heavy on me to this day. That my mission put people's lives in jeopardy. I mean, that should never have been allowed to happen. So those are some of the negatives. That being said, it is the best job in the world. I'm convinced of that. I have a pretty good job now, but I say the rapporteurship, for all of the sleepless nights, the endless travel, the thematic reports for me were very difficult to write. I'm not an academic. It's a voice that I write op-eds, I don't write thematic reports. So I could do it, but I needed a lot of assistance with that. But it was the ability to be in such a privileged position, to be able to help bring the voices and experiences of the most marginalized, vulnerable, disadvantaged, and discriminated against populations, to bring all of that, to be in such a privileged position and to put it at the feet, on the tables of governments, was a phenomenal experience. And I think that for me was the best part of it, was feeling like I was actually adding value to the tremendous efforts of the human rights defenders on the ground, that I had their back, that I was supporting them, and that I was forcing governments to look at these issues square on. It was exhilarating from that point of view. And I think I managed to move a few governments along the way. So I'll stop there.
So I know I said I was going to go to two of you for each of these final questions, but I think I'm now going to make my own decision and just have one of you respond to each, just to make sure that we do have time for the Q&A, which I see is building. But I have two more questions that I do want to get out there. Francois, why don't I go to you for the next question, which is, and I think we've had aspects of this come out in responses from all of you, but how important do you think that the special procedure system is, this notion of the crown jewel? Is that how you see it within the UN system? But I guess maybe building on that, do you think there's ways, and I think this has come out a little bit already as well, that the special procedures could be improved or strengthened?
I think the idea of crown jewels is right. We have the most important thing about special procedures, that we are independent. We're not the voice of our country. We're not the voice of the UN. We're not on the payroll. We can deliver reports, and the next day the Secretary General can tell the media that the UN disagrees fundamentally with our report, and that we don't represent the UN, etc. But this independence gives us a lot of strength, especially in states. When states receive us, in many cases, they know that we don't carry a geostrategic agenda decided by other people in national capitals or in Geneva or New York. We come as experts, bronze medals, silver medals. we are often unknown quantities, and we come with our expertise and our goodwill, and we make reports, and many of us try to respect state sovereignty and write reports that are not acerbic, that are trying to push them to do the right thing rather than criticize them across the board. And that is felt as useful. I've felt that with Tunisia. Tunisia has invited me back several times to discuss their bills and on migration issues. I've had reports from Qatar. Qatar is moving very, very slowly towards protecting temporary migrant workers, and it's only on paper for the moment, but they refer to my reports. They say, well, since we've done that, we've done that. It's not fast and it's not deep, but at least, the needle has moved a little. And that is due, I think, in great part from our independence. How could we make it better? I think the resource issue is key. I heard, I haven't checked that, but I heard that in the UN, you have 3 councils: the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, and the Human Rights Council. Well, it seems that the human rights issue inside the UN commands 3% of the budget, which for a third pillar is a very small amount. I think that states don't want to put more money on that because we're there to criticize them, and they're not going to fund people who are going to criticize them. But the resource issue is important. I don't think we should be paid. I don't think we should be on the payroll, because that limits our independence. But having a compensation package for the organizations that employ us without us being directly paid, that would help. Not for universities necessarily, because we have the ability to move our agenda around. We organize our courses, we organize our research around these visits, etc. Many of us can do that. And there are long periods where we don't give courses, where we can do that. December, for example, this is a time where courses are over, students are preparing for exams. We can do it in a 2-week mission. That's not difficult. But for people like Leilani, having a package for that would be important. Having more support. I have had the good fortune of having excellent human rights officers in Geneva, and I often had 2, and that was great. But I could have done with 5. You know, there was so much more we could do if we had more support. Visiting more countries. We are limited to, you know, on average, we're limited to 2 country visits per year, and we have to produce 2 country reports and 2 thematic reports. You know, we could visit more countries. We could do group visits. You know, I visited, very often I visited Italy and Greece in one go. I went for a few days in Italy and then a few days in Greece. This could be organized differently, and we could visit a lot more countries. In the end, you know, 2 countries per year, it's 12 countries, and, you know, for your mandate, for the whole of your mandate. It's not much. We could do more than that. And then we need to defeat all the proposals to weaken the mandates. So one, you know, there are many things that are happening. It's, you know, it's horse trading in a diplomatic forum. So some countries want to eliminate country mandates. And we've seen the number of country mandates go up and down depending on who's pushing against them. And they don't like country mandates because many countries fear that it will be their turn at one point. And they don't want that. They like thematic mandates, especially innocuous mandates like right to housing, for example, as Leilani. You know, that's the kind of perception they have. But so that, you know, maintaining these country mandates is important. Increasing the number, you know, one strategy is to increase the number of thematic mandates in order to dilute their importance. I think that special rapporteurs were much more forcefully listened to when they were less numerous. And there has been an increase in the number of mandates that maybe lessens the perception of our voice. And then there are mandates that are created out of horse trading. You know, several countries want a mandate on something which is very relevant, and some countries oppose it, and then they get their own mandates. And so a few mandates are what I call Mickey Mouse mandates. And that also weakens the perception of expertise of the whole system. And lastly, one element which is key is that many countries would like that all the funding comes from the UN for the mandates. And people like Leilani had to do fundraising, and many mandates are doing fundraising, finding philanthropy or countries ready to put money on a worthy object without threatening their independence. And that's the key aspect. But that fundraising is essential if you know, we want to do our role. And many countries would like to you know, curtail that and bring all this money into the UN to be redistributed equally to all mandates. And we have to fight that off as well. So there are many things that are happening at the same time, many moving parts.
Great, thanks, Francois. So the last question from me, I'm going to come to you on this one, Michael. And I think given what you told us at the outset about the reaction of the Canadian government to your appointment, it's perhaps fitting to ask you this question. So here's what it is. There's, I mean, one thing that the three of you have in common is that you're all brilliant and ardent human rights champions. The other thing, of course, that you all have in common is that you're Canadian. And I'm wondering if there's anything about having been Canadian, or for you still being Canadian, obviously, in this role, that you feel is notable. Any advantages, any challenges, anything that comes with the maple leaf as a special rapporteur?
Thanks for that, Alex. And I'll try to be efficient. I know there's a buildup of questions that want to be asked. So quickly, 2 thoughts. On the positive side, being Canadian, I think there's an aura when we go abroad, deserved or not, about being Canadian. There's recognized that we have not only advanced standard of living, but there's a high respect for the rule of law, and human rights are protected and seem to be protected in Canada. And so that, I think, opened up doors for me that may not have been opened up as widely as that. The other thing I'll say about positive of being a Canadian is that because there were Canadian special rapporteurs who went before me of extremely high quality, of which Francois and Leilani are exhibit A with respect to this, it's made my work that much easier because they tend to expect good things from you. It means there's a standard to live up to, which is not always easy to do. But that does help you in the terms of there's almost an instant respect that is one is being given to you. On the negative, it's really been an extraordinary disappointment in dealing with Canadian officials particularly on my mandate. For a country that proclaims expressly that human rights and the rule of law are a cornerstone, that actually has a very good statement on the website of Global Affairs Canada with respect to the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that rights and international law are to be the framework for guiding this. The gap between Canada's stated position and proclamations of adherence to the law and its actual performance on this issue is enormous. It's a huge amount of daylight with respect to this. And my dealings with Global Affairs Canada, my dealings with ambassadors, my dealings with political leaders on Parliament Hill have all been extraordinarily underwhelming, with a few exceptions with regards to this. And I should say, if I can throw this in, Canada has a very unattractive position with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At the United Nations General Assembly, which I think is probably like the single best touchstone of this, we have for the past 10 years, through the Harper government and through the Trudeau government, voted against virtually the entire package of resolutions on Israel and Palestine each and every year, even though those resolutions are thoroughly grounded within the UN framework of international law, the laws of occupation, the laws of human rights, and international criminal law with respect to this. And I think I can say with some confidence that Canada's last two bids to sit on the Security Council in 2012 and again in 2020 were lost in part, not entirely, but certainly in part, because of its position at the General Assembly, consistently voting with a handful of countries against what the vast majority of the world winds up accepting on this. So it's been an interesting experience as a Canadian being a special rapporteur on this particular issue.
Great, thanks for that. And thus ends my round of questions. And now we already have 4 questions, and there may be time for 1 or 2 more. So if anyone had something they haven't put in the Q&A function yet, get it in there. The first 2 questions both come from Paul Meyer. I'm assuming this might be the Paul Meyer who was once Canada's ambassador at the UN in Geneva. So he's obviously got some insights and perspective himself. The first question, I think Francois already touched on, so maybe I'll ask Leilani or Michael if they have any views on whether the proliferation of special procedure mandates has diluted the efficacy of the mechanism as a whole. Either of you want to pick that one up?
Leilani, you want to go first on that? You've had more time to reflect upon this.
I don't have an opinion on that. I don't know if it's true that, I mean, maybe it has some watering down effect overall, but I doubt. To me, it would seem weird that just because there's a proliferation of special rapporteurs, that suddenly the rapporteur on the right to housing isn't taken seriously and isn't. I would be surprised if there was that direct relationship. I don't think it benefits us. I've never been one to like invent new human rights where they don't need to be invented, where you can use the existing procedures and mechanisms, but life does evolve, and sometimes you do need new rapporteurs or new attention to a new arising, emerging human rights issue. So, I mean, look at Francois' own example of the way migrants weren't taken as a human rights issue and not by the international system. And now, I mean, come on, it would be unthinkable not to be engaged in the migrant issue with from a perspective that didn't include human rights.
Right. If I can add to that, I'll comment mostly with respect to the country mandates for special procedures. Because I think by and large, I think almost all of the thematic mandates can be justified. But when it comes to the country mandates, the biggest question is why aren't there more? with regards to this. And this is where you really see power politics, and probably big power politics, playing a role in what countries get focused on and what countries do not. I think Israel and its, and particularly with respect to its role in the occupied Palestinian territories, deserves a special rapporteur mandate because of the responsibility the UN has towards that, and because the degree of human rights violations are serious. But I can't justify why there are some other countries that don't have this. I know that there were other ways that the human rights system got around the fact that there wasn't a special rapporteur with respect to Syria, or with respect to Egypt, or any other countries that you can wind up naming. There are only, I think, now 13. There had been one, for example, for Côte d'Ivoire that was eliminated. There's now a new one with respect to Burundi. I can justify whether there should be one for North Korea, for Myanmar, for Cambodia, but there's lots of countries why I can't justify that. And when you see the lineup of speakers who are there to comment on the reports for special rapporteurs with the specific geographic mandates, that gave me an education as to where the lineup was and why these mandates were called for. And the countries usually that have these mandates hate them. They don't. Very few of them want to cooperate. They feel they're put under an unfair spotlight. Then the arguments about whataboutism winds up coming up. Why are we singled out and others are not? So that is probably the UN not at its very best with respect to that. And I haven't thought through a fairer system of designating this, but I do know, for the good of human rights worldwide, the special procedures is an important feature of this, but it's not the only feature. And then you find other ways to fill those gaps. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch are both well endowed with funding, and they make the universal application of human rights a cornerstone of their mandate. So the countries that aren't named by special procedures do get attention where they deserve through other means.
So I'm going to come to Paul's second question at the end, just to make sure that everyone else who's lined up here gets their question in. The next one comes from Anne-Marie Clark, who, number one, thanks the panel, but she'd be interested to hear about how much of the rapporteurs worked with NGOs in carrying out their mandates, and how this may have contributed positively or negatively to your work. Who wants to kick off on that one? Francois.
Yeah. For my mandate, I'm not speaking for all the mandates, but certainly for my mandate, it was key, period. It's central. When you organize a mission to a country, you organize the mission with the Foreign Affairs Ministry of that country, and you have visits with meetings with ministers, directors of cabinet, people who are, I would mean directors of detention centers, et cetera, et cetera. So you meet the officials. And then you have a second part that you don't discuss with the government, which is meeting people on the ground, meeting NGOs, civil society, meeting international organizations. I always met with UNHCRs, IOMs, the UN country team in the country as well. But I met with NGOs. I went to refugee camps that were not official, where people were left to their own devices, and you had to meet people who worked with them, etc. And that is key. And you don't share that with the government. Mind you, I think the governments know everything of what you do every day. They are following you. And I don't know how much our communications are surveilled, but I think they know everything, but we don't share that with them. And we have these discussions which are private. Second, before we do a mission, we always read everything that's been written. And we have the reports of the treaty bodies, we have the reports to the Universal Periodic Review, but we read all the reports by all the NGOs that work on the ground. And that is part of the preparation. And then we know what type of questions we can ask. And then our reports are used by Universal Periodic Review, committees, treaty bodies, but also by civil society. And you know, there's a loop there. Civil society will ask the minister, well, the special rapporteur 2 years ago said you should do this. What did you do since then? And that loop is extremely important. That feeds itself. And in my opinion, what I've done most was to add a layer of information to the database on migration. Defining, you know, better defining the concepts, changing the vocabulary, changing the narrative. That's what we do. In the end, that's what stays. And that cannot be done by one person. It's done by a series of people working together, and that includes civil society, absolutely.
Leilani or Michael, maybe just one of you. Yeah, Leilani?
Oh, I did. That was by accident. Michael, would you like to go?
Sure. Let me be very quick with respect to this. The civil society groups, as I think I've already mentioned, in working on Israel and Palestine, have been absolutely indispensable to my work. I've said before, this is the best documented conflict in the modern world. And I often wonder, and I've had conversations with my colleagues who are special rapporteurs with respect to Belarus or North Korea or Myanmar, and I'm thinking, how do you get your work done? I mean, you have so much more difficulty in being able to collect facts, determine if they're reliable or not, and putting this in an overall framework of where the trends are in human rights. I luckily don't have that. The Israeli human rights organizations that are critical of the occupation, the Palestinian human rights organizations, and the regional international human rights and NGOs that I've worked with have produced top grade reports, and they welcome, they want to see somebody who's active, who's interested, who obviously cares about the mandate, but who can say things in the forums that they don't always get a chance to be able to do. And where I think the information being given to me by NGOs is reliable, responsible, and can be justified, then I'm happy to go ahead and amplify that on the various immediate issues and the various analytical issues that I have to wind up doing. So, you know, the relationships I've had, and I was told this at the very beginning of my job. You said, not only will you be relying a lot on what civil society is doing, that will be the most satisfying part of your work, because the relationships you're building with them are, you know, wind up turning into, if not friendships, you know, certainly highly respected professional relationships that you have with them.
Great.
Alex,
okay.
Can I just jump in very quickly?
Sure.
To say just two very, very short things. One, I felt it would have been irresponsible of me not to be closely working with, listening to, et cetera, the NGOs and grassroots movements on the ground, because they always know better than I'm going to as an internationalist, and they're domestic. So I felt a responsibility there. But that's not to say, there were a couple of occasions in my mandate where I felt I needed to take the mandate in a certain direction that some of the NGOs didn't necessarily want me to go in. I recall being critiqued for not doing enough on forced evictions. And I felt very strong. And of course, my mandate was really dominated by that homelessness financialization, particularly financialization stuff. And I mean, you have to take decisions of priorities. You have 6 years, you know, you've got certain number of missions and thematic reports. And so like, you have to prioritize. And I felt really strongly it was important to bite off an area of the right to housing that was really about government's failure to act, rather than asking governments to refrain from acting. So that's the negative positive divide in the social and economic rights world. But with forced evictions, you're often asking governments, just please stop. But I really wanted to use the mandate as an opportunity to say, you know what, governments, you've got to do some things, and this is what you've got to do. And so that ended up making me a little less on the forced eviction side and a little more on the positive obligation side. And that wasn't necessarily in keeping with what all the NGOs wanted me to do.
So now we have a question from Slava Balan, who asks, how would you propose to elevate, to take the mechanism of the special procedures to a new level in advancing human rights within and potentially beyond the UN system? What should be done in terms of strengthening their powers, institutionally harmonizing and synergizing this mechanism with other UN bodies, and mechanisms. So there's a lot in there, but I suppose in a general sense, it's, you know, in what ways can the special procedures be taken up a notch? Who might like to kick things off here? Oh, no Francois is reaching for the button.
Yeah, since there was a silence. I think there's an issue of resources. That's a key issue. If we just doubled the percentage of the UN budget dedicated to human rights from 3 to 6%, that would do a lot of good. And it would not be, you know, putting the UN in jeopardy, but I think there's no political will to do that. OHCHR, the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is full of great people, but they are crumbling under the work that needs to be done and the little they can do with the resources they have. And I think that there would be, I mean, we've mentioned that already. We have to preserve the independence of the special rapporteur. So you can't start paying them. To me, that's a key point. You don't want them on the payroll because then they become the voice of the UN, and you don't want that. But there would be ways to strengthen all the resources at their disposal. We mentioned a package for the organization they come from. We've mentioned having more human rights officers working for them, having a more systematic collection of information, the database, that we're not scrambling every time we start a mission. You know, that we see the human rights officers saying, okay, who's been to this country? And then they start searching in the archives. You know, this should be organized. This should be, if there was a proper, proper funding of OHCHR, this would be organized like other parts of the UN are organized. Human rights, as Leilani mentioned, or human rights touch all the issues of human life. And so we could have, you know, we could triple the number of mandates. I'm not sure it'd be a good thing, but we could triple the number of mandates and still be missing issues that need to be covered. It's not happening. Everything is very political inside the Human Rights Council. Everything is negotiated. It's horse trading. It's the nature of the UN. I won't, you know, we won't change that anytime soon. As long as it's a cooperation forum, we can't change the nature of the UN. But a lot of resources would be needed in order to support the work and allow mandates to be more institutionalized with, for example, at the beginning, I don't know for Leilani and Michael, but at the beginning of my mandate, there was no transfer of competence. And I arrived as a newbie and my human rights officer was new too. We had no idea, you know, apart from reading the reports, we had no idea what had happened, the connections, the address list, you know, the Rolodex, as we used to say. We didn't have any of that. And so the institutionalization would be a good thing, but preserving the independence.
So I'm going to go to a last question, because I think this gets us to something that actually hasn't yet come up that much in all that we've covered so far. And this comes from Karen Moyer, and hopefully we'll have time for each of you to briefly respond to this. She talks about her own background, which is by day, she works on Indigenous child and family service reform, and by night, she is a member of the Yukon Human Rights Commission, and in both of those roles is confronted with significant human rights issues, particularly with respect to discrimination. She's asking, do you have views on how local or regional human rights defenders can better tap in to the valuable work of UN mandate holders? So I think we've kind of talked about that relationship with civil society, but I think there's an interesting question of how to even kind of ramp that up a bit. Who'd like to kick off here?
Let me
Michael?
start off very briefly, and I'll because I want to make sure everybody's got a chance. But I think we have the possibility of entering into, if not a golden age, maybe a silver age of international human rights law.
Here we are, silver again.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Francois can talk about a bronze age, I guess. But But I'm beginning to see encouraging signs that certainly from the courts are accepting that international human rights law is a cornerstone of interpreting the Charter, that we are beginning to see at least a verbal or rhetorical commitment by governments that they have to pay attention to international human rights standards. Whether or not they're going to be held to it is going to be probably a task for civil society. But if we begin to understand that these are not two separate solar systems that don't intersect with each other, domestic human rights law and international human rights law, and we begin to realize what each can contribute to the other. I think on the one hand, there are many valuable things we're doing here in Canada to create, I think, a forward-looking domestic human rights system that can contribute to the international understanding. But as well, we have huge gaps here in Canada that I think could be ably filled by what the UN does, and particularly by what the UN Special Procedures winds up doing as well.
Great. Francois or Leilani? Go ahead, Leilani.
I really liked Michael's response, and I wanted to say I really liked Francois's response to the previous question as well. Very thoughtful, and I don't know that I fully understand the question. I think that rapporteurs make themselves very available to national human rights institutions and more subnational human rights institutions, as well as, I think they're pretty nimble and available. So I don't know if I have much to add except to say that they are completely undervalued in this country. It's remarkable. I mean, Michael, Francois, and I all have very similar experiences from very different mandates. So it's not about the subject. It's not only about the subject matter. It's so weird that a country wouldn't avail themselves of the expertise of rapporteurs and want to somehow engage rapporteurs and get rapporteurs more engaged throughout the country itself where we're from, even though we're not necessarily working on what's going on in the country. So I do wonder if there isn't something there about trying to get governments themselves to understand that rapporteurs are a resource and very valuable and can be used in a variety of ways. I don't know, sorry.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good point.
Maybe one point I can add in terms of technique. Special rapporteurs are available to receive any kind of communication, and they can write letters to governments. So when civil society has an issue, they can write an email to the special rapporteur, and many special rapporteurs, I'm not saying all, but many special rapporteurs will start a conversation. And at one point, a letter can be sent to a government saying, we've been alerted to this situation. Can we, and this is something I've done in my mandate very often. I've signed, I don't know, maybe 30 letters per year for 6 years or so, on average, something like that, to governments. I've been alerted to this issue. This seems to be serious. Please let me know what kind of measures you have taken or intend to take in order to remedy the situation. You're very polite. You're not accusing anyone. You're just alerting them to a situation and asking questions. And that, to me, is the power we have. We have the power to ask questions from governments. And in the vast majority of cases, we receive answers. I don't know about your experience, but certainly I received answers. When I first wrote a report to the EU, it took some time, but I received a 25-page answer to the report, single-spaced, which was written at the same time by the Commission and the Council, and you could distinguish the paragraphs by the tone, well, of whether they came from the Commission or from the European Council. And that was very interesting. States do respond to that because their reputation is at stake. And that creates pressure. It doesn't lead to change necessarily, but it creates pressure. It's one more element. And probably inside government, at one point, one civil servant will say, okay, let's do something. I want to, I don't want to receive this flack every time. So let's do something, let's change something, let's respond to the need. and change will happen, but not immediately necessarily.
All right, we're going to need to wrap up because I know that both Michael and Francois have a hard stop at 1:30. So I'm just going to, on behalf of everyone, before I turn it to John for final words, I just want to express immense appreciation and gratitude to all three of you, both for what has been an incredibly rich and fascinating conversation. I know all three of you well, and I know the special procedures well, and I was on the edge of my seat. This was really fascinating. So thank you for that, but also thank you for being the remarkable human rights champions, even if not fully appreciated by your own government, the remarkable human rights champions you are. If we were a room full, I'm sure there would be a standing ovation right now, both for the session and for everything you've brought to the human rights struggle. So thank you for that on Human Rights Day. And John, do you have last words? And I think Michael in particular may literally have to run, so don't hesitate to do so if you need to.
I will just take 30 seconds. Thank you, Alex. On behalf of the Human Rights Research and Education Center, thanks to you took the word out of my mouth, Alex. Remarkable, not only session, the remarkable people who we count amongst us as fellow citizens, as I think epitomizing what most Canadians would feel proud and pleased to see contributing in the world as Canadians. I know that that's not what motivates our speakers today, not because they are Canadians, because they are dedicated to human rights and to the values that are contained therein. And the challenges, I would add the courage, conviction, honesty and integrity that they embody is really a tribute, not just to themselves, but to all of us. And if they're not appreciated in some parts of the world, I can certainly attest, they are extremely widely appreciated around the world. And we are all benefits. Thanks to everyone again, thanks to the participants and the viewers on the 73rd anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 40th anniversary of our center, and stay tuned for the 40th anniversary of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. We have a lot of work to do, and we look forward to engaging with everyone in the future. Thank you again. Thanks to Alex for your excellent moderation.
Yeah, big thanks to Alex.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Happy Human Rights Day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Take care.